As we begin, I wonder if if we can just use the chat pod to share where everybody's coming from. Nancy's already shared that she's from Winnipeg. If everyone else is able to share just where you're from, that would be great. Hello, Danielle. Hi, David. Hi, Janet. And hello, Lydia. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. This webinar today will have offer an overview and introduction to Intercultural Ministries. We'll have time to explore what, and hello, Andrea. Hello again. So we'll have some time to explore what intercultural and culture mean. For some of you, this might be new, and for some of you, this might be a quick review and a refresher. After we've come to maybe some common ground around what this all means, then we'll spend some time looking at how to really engage with intercultural ministries in local congregations. So we'll spend some time looking at practical ways of what congregations can do, some practical things, including tools, ideas, and resources. Throughout the webinar, there will be lots of spaces for questions, so please feel free to type your question as it occurs to you. There are specific spaces for questions and conversation discussion throughout where I will pause, but please don't feel you have to wait for those pauses. Feel free to ask your question or ask comments as we go. So as we begin, thanks for sharing where you're from. But as we begin, I just wanted to ask if there are any questions that you have already, or if there are any ideas that you are hopeful that we'll cover in this webinar over the next little while. No? Okay. Well, there will be other spaces, and please feel free to ask questions as we go. The two files that are here that Josephine mentioned, one is an upcoming workshop for those of you who are in Hamilton Conference or in driving distance of Hamilton Conference. There's an upcoming workshop at the end of the month. And there are two new intercultural DVDs, and I'll reference those at various points throughout the presentation. So you're welcome to download those if you would like and share them with friends and colleagues. So today we'll start with a brief background on the vision of Intercultural Ministries, exploring what it means, and before we move to kind of practical next steps for congregations. So in terms of background, in 2006 at the 39th General Council, the United Church of Canada made a commitment to becoming an intercultural church. And this idea came from different cultural communities in the church who wondered if there was a different way in which we could be church together. At that time, intercultural was named as mutually reciprocal relationships among and between peoples. And I always say that's such a mouthful. There is so much contained in that one short phrase. But the choice of intercultural and that naming was quite intentional, not to be multicultural, not to be cross-cultural. And there was intention in the naming of intercultural because there was so much in the meaning of this mouthful of mutually reciprocal relationships among and between peoples. So the idea was that intercultural could encompass several key ideas. One, the idea of mutuality, that is, there's some give and take. Also this idea of reciprocity, which in some ways is similar to mutuality in that there's some exchange. Relationships as a way of being together as church. And this notion of among and between, which can signify that there is work to do both within a particular cultural community, because no community is homogeneous. But it can also signify that there is work to do among communities. So all of this and more was encompassed in the intercultural vision. Leadership for developing the intercultural vision was given to cultural minority communities across the church. So in particular, Aboriginal, Francophone, racialized communities, and deaf peoples. And these cultural groups had the responsibility for shaping the transformative vision for the whole church. In this report from 2006 that went to that General Council, it was called A Transformative Vision for the United Church of Canada. And in that, it names names many things, but this is just one quote from that full report. That God is calling us to transformation as individuals, as communities, and as church, with all the traditions and cultures we have been gifted with. Not one thing will be left untouched in God's transformative power, including our culture that is the intersection of our beliefs, our values, our worldviews, our languages, our customs, our traditions, our ethnic heritages, and our memories. So the idea was that this would be transformative for the whole church. And the hope was to create a church where the intercultural dimensions of ministries is a denominational priority in living out its commitment to racial justice, where there's mutually respectful diversity and full and equitable participation of all, and where racial and cultural power imbalances are redressed. So that's where it began to emerge from. Of course, there was a lot of work that happened before then, but that was 2006, and the ideas and visions around transforming the church continued. And in 2009, at the 40th General Council, another report was offered called Intercultural Ministries, a process of church-wide transformation. And in this report, the importance of transforming church structures and systems was renamed, and cultural empire was named as one of the challenges to becoming a transformed intercultural church. And this report also offered some reflections on transformation. And it named that the anticipated transformation is such that it will change some of our ways of being church together. The church's processes, policies, and procedures will all be examined through an intercultural lens, and this will, in turn, affect how we articulate theologies, how we make decisions, how we proactively create spaces for diverse cultural groups to participate fully in decision-making processes within the church. So there's really this idea of transformation, always of transformation from different cultural communities. And the idea was naming that to be truly a transformed church based on justice, equity, and the redress of power, that becoming an intercultural church means touching on all aspects of the church's life. And therefore, nobody is left unchanged in the intercultural process. In reality, some might examine their own culture more deeply. Some might be changed in their interactions with others. But many might learn more about what it means to be in community together. But collectively, all of us might go through this process of transformation. Now, we might say that intercultural has also to do with deepening our understandings of difference. So it's grounded in many commitments that the church has already made around racial justice, around inclusion, around equity, and as a justice-seeking church. We might also say that intercultural is the call to live together in intentional ways where there is mutual recognition and understanding of difference through intentional self-examination, relationship building, and equitable access to power. It is also our attempt to respond faithfully to such a call. So in some ways, that's where things emerged from. There was lots of work done along the way, but I've just offered a little bit of the overall framework, and in particular, the commitments around that came from General Council. In some ways, because this forms the framework and background for what intercultural ministries means. And perhaps at this point, I'll pause and see if there are any questions so far. I'll also welcome some of our new people to the webinar. But are there any questions so far? No? Okay, I'll continue on, and feel free to type questions as they occur to you, or comments, or anything as we go along. So, Before we go into understanding practically what this might mean for congregations, I thought it might be helpful to spend a little bit of more time exploring what culture might mean. In some ways, an understanding of culture can deepen our understanding of what intercultural might mean. So first, before I offer you some ideas around what culture is, does anyone have any ideas about what culture might mean? You can feel free to type them into the box. What do you think culture is? Any ideas about what that is? How would you begin to define or describe culture? Yes, shared customs and values, yes. Norms, learned patterns, and ways of being and seeing and doing, yes. Mm-hmm. The shared intellectual, linguistic, artistic, and so on environment that binds a group together. Yes, all of these. These are great. These are all ways, excellent ways of describing what culture is. So thank you, Jeannie and Lydia and David. Those are great. In addition, we might also say that culture is the shared and often unspoken understandings in a group. So sometimes people say it's what a group knows, what everybody knows that everybody knows, but without necessarily needing to name it or describe it. So one thing I always love is, in church on Sundays, in churches I've attended, everybody just knows that at some point while the hymn is being played, at some point near the end of that hymn, while it's being introduced perhaps by the piano or organ, everybody stands. And everybody always stands at the exact same moment. And we just know it's I've never been in a context where it's been announced, but everybody just knows the moment to stand. And in some ways that's because those of us who are part of those particular congregations have a shared culture in terms of what happens during the singings of hymns. In many other cultural contexts, people don't stand. Maybe they sit during the singing of the hymns and they stand during the scripture reading. But for those of us who stand at that particular point during the singing of a hymn, we have a shared culture in that particular context. So that's one rather simplistic example. We might also say that culture is a series of lenses that shape what we see and what we don't see, how we perceive and interpret, and where we draw our boundaries. So it helps us kind of make sense of our world. And yet, sometimes culture might appear to be invisible to us, but it still shapes our ideas of what's important. It influences our attitudes and values and begins to animate our behaviors. We might say that at times, culture might appear to be operating below the surface, that it's shifting and dynamic, and yet it orients us. It points us in particular ways, points us towards some things and away from other things. All of us belong to multiple cultures. So, we've talked about shared customs, values, norms, intellectual, linguistic. All of us belong to multiple cultural communities. And so we might transition and switch between different cultural groups within us and between us from a very, very early age. And we might also say that culture encompasses groups that share race, ethnicity, nationality, age, gender identities, generation, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, differing abilities, political, religious affiliation, language, and so on and so on. It's quite a long list if we were to name all of the identity groups that might be part of culture. And yet, as we become aware of our own cultural lenses and others' lenses, both our own and one another's, we begin to recognize that there's no such thing as a cultural-free perspective. I know for myself, I wear either glasses or contacts, and the lenses help shift things into focus. And all of us have those similar types of lenses that help us make sense of our world. So there's no such thing as a cultural free perspective. And yet, because our understanding of culture can be so broad, our understanding of what intercultural might mean is also very broad. So sometimes one of the challenges is that intercultural is sometimes used as a substitute for ethnic. But as we've begun to kind of explore and name what intercultural means, it's actually much broader than that. It's a broad understanding of transforming the ways in which we are church together, based on looking at issues of power and difference. And so this is where we are today, doing our best collectively as church to try to live into this call. So let me pause and see, are there any questions so far? Questions or comments? Okay, I will continue, and again, please feel free to type questions and comments as we go along. As we continue, we will spend a bit more time talking about what does this actually mean for congregations. We spent a little time talking about kind of broad theory. How do you define what intercultural means? How do we define what culture means? But before we go there, perhaps we can spend just a few minutes sharing about why is the church engaged in this ministry? Why is this important? Becoming intercultural church communities, this kind of change, this kind of transformation takes work. So why? Why are we doing it? So perhaps we can begin by sharing a little bit from a video. And this video is called Our Common Vision, Becoming an Intercultural Church. And as we move into speaking about resources, this video itself is an excellent resource from the United Church of Canada. It's available from UCRD's store. It comes with a study guide and worship ideas. We're only going to do one short segment today, but in total there are 18 segments on the video, and that's one of the things that's described on the file box there, the new Intercultural DVD resource. So we are going to watch just a segment of Our Common Vision as we explore this question of why. Why are we doing this?
Becoming an intercultural church moves us to the very beginning of our faith. The Bible was written in the context of racial, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. In the beginning, becoming an intercultural church moves us to the very beginning. And God said the creation was good. The Bible was written in the context of racial, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. Each part of God's creation in the beginning, God created the earth of the Creator. And God said the creation was good. In this diverse creation was many diverse were present and interdependent. Of every kind. People were made in the image of God's creation. We were made to be in relationship with God and with one another. But there were many divisions in this diverse creation. Many were present of every kind. People were made in the image of God. God reminds the people of Israel, to be in relationship with God and with one another. A stranger, but there were many divisions in the diverse communities that followed. You know the heart of a stranger. For you were once
At one
strangers
point,
in the land of
God
Egypt.
reminds the people of
God
Israel,
insists on hospitality
"You
and
shall
justice
not
for foreigners
oppress
who are
a
often
stranger
treated like
in
they
your
don't belong.
land. You know
The
the heart
disenfranchised are to
of
be
a
given
stranger,
access to justice,
for you were once
outsiders to be given a
strangers
place
in the
to
land
belong.
of Egypt."
We hear how the
God
psalmist wept
insists
by
on
the rivers of
hospitality and
Babylon.
justice for
The
foreigners who
exiles
are
had
often
hung up their
treated like they
harps
don't
and wondered how
belong.
they could sing the Lord's
The
song in a foreign
disenfranchised are
land.
to be given access to
They longed to
justice,
be reconciled to
outsiders to
God
be given
and to
a
be
place to
restored to the
belong.
land.
We hear how the
In
psalmist
their
wept by the
exile, they
rivers of
sung about the
Babylon.
identity they
The
had
exiles
lost.
had hung up their
But
harps
in
and
times
wondered
of
how they could
loss,
sing the
our
Lord's
scriptures
song in a
teach us
foreign
of the
land.
promises of things yet
They
to
longed
come.
to be reconciled to
Isaiah
God
prays for a
and to
house
be
of prayer
restored
for
to the
all
land.
God's peoples. Isaiah
In
also
their
offers
exile,
us a
they sung
vision
about
where
the
the wolf and
identity
the
they had
lamb lie
lost.
down together in
But in
God's
times of
peaceable
loss,
kingdom.
our scriptures
When
teach us of the
Jesus was
promises
born,
of things
he
yet to
walked the
come.
land, and
Isaiah
his
prays
ministry
for a
was
house
full
of
of
prayer for all God's
cross-cultural
peoples.
encounters.
Isaiah also offers us a
Jesus
vision
himself
where the
broke
wolf and the
barriers of
lamb
race,
lie down
class,
together in God's
gender,
peaceable
and
kingdom.
social norms to
When
create a
Jesus was
community of
born,
believers
he walked the
where all were
land,
welcome.
and his ministry was full of
Jesus did not simply
cross-cultural
offer to
encounters.
include those who were on the margins.
Jesus himself
Jesus' own assumptions were challenged by the Syrophoenician woman. She dared to ask Jesus, a man from a different culture, to heal her daughter. Jesus allowed these kinds of encounters with the marginalized people, which helped shape and change him. Becoming an intercultural church reignites God's original vision given at Pentecost. At Pentecost, each person heard the gospel spoken in their own language. Thus, God's Spirit, working with people from many nations, set in motion the early Christian church. Cultural and linguistic identities were left in place, but unified in a new and larger expression of common humanity. Throughout the New Testament, we hear about God's call to create different kinds of community together. And then, at the very end of our Bible, there is a promise that God's good creation will be restored. Becoming an intercultural church is one way of living faithfully into the gospel. It is a journey. It is part of our faith, part of our mission, and part of our call. Thanks be to God.
So hello again, everyone. Sorry for the brief technical difficulties. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so we're back online. Wonderful. Okay, so that was a clip from the video I mentioned called Our Common Vision. And in some ways that brings us back to the call to become an intercultural church. So, so that brings us to the why question. So I wondered, though, at this point, if there were any questions or comments after that video, or at this point as we go along. Good video, great, thanks. Okay. Okay, so we've spoken about the vision and the call. So practically then, what does this all mean for a congregation, specifically for a local congregation? If you're a part of a congregation that's interested in being more interculturally inclusive, where do you start? I'll offer some broad ideas first, and then also some specifics in terms of specific areas such as children and youth, worship, meetings. So perhaps let's start with community life. Practically speaking, for a congregation to start or continue to embrace a focus on intercultural ministries, one good place to start might be to talk about the theological and biblical basis for why we are doing this. The video that we've just seen offers a biblical and theological vision. It might be also helpful to embrace a vision for your whole church that is intentional, and then to talk about this openly with the congregation so it's clear to everybody why this is part of the church's life. So to begin with the theological and biblical basis. Next might be to embrace a vision. And the vision can include a broad strategy that embraces difference and that talks about shifting power. You may choose to gather with other people to pray and discern and dream big and then write it all down. Your vision can be courageous and edgy, or even just a sentence or two so that people can memorize it. One church that I know of has, as part of its mission statement, something similar to being a vibrant, diverse community that is serving God through loving, sharing, and justice seeking. So the congregation, members of the congregation together discerned this vision and then did its best to continue to live into what they think it means to be a diverse community. And each week when that church community gathers, the mission statement is printed on the church bulletin as a constant reminder of the community that the church is seeking to become. So the vision reminds them of striving to become this intercultural community. They did their discernment, and then they just remind themselves every week, okay, this is our goal. This is what we are aiming for. A third thing might be to do some very intentional self-examination. If the focus is on creating an intercultural community that is engaging effectively with difference, then it's important also to know then who the community actually is. So what degree of difference are we looking at? Sorry, let me pause. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Do I need to adjust my settings? It's okay. Okay. And welcome to Aruna. Janet, is it possible to maybe adjust your volume a little bit? I'm wondering if so far it looks like you might be the only one. Oh, okay. I have one of those too. Okay, so we'll continue on. We're talking about intentional self-examination as one way in terms of community life. And there might be multiple ways of doing this. One might be to look at what I call the cultural iceberg. And an iceberg might be a helpful tool for self-analysis and reflection. So in an iceberg, 10% and the iceberg is more of an analogy for culture. So just like in an iceberg, 10% of the iceberg is found above the waterline and 90% is found below. We might say something similar about culture. And we might say that 10% of culture is found above the surface and 90% is found below the surface. So in the 10% that's above the surface, we would say that these are external aspects of culture. So these are things that are easily observed by the senses. So things we can touch, we can taste, we can hear, feel, or smell. They're all explicit. We might also say that they are explicitly learned, they are conscious, they are easily changeable, and they are objective. So if somebody asks you why, a why question, there might be a very clear reason and explanation. So an example of external culture might be clothing. It's very easy to change your clothes, and it's very easy to adjust depending on what circumstance you're in. And if somebody says, well, why are you wearing a snowsuit? You might say, well, because it's cold outside. And you can easily adjust depending on what's happening. For people who are multilingual, it's easy to adjust and switch between languages. So these are all aspects of external culture, the 10% that's above the surface line. It might include things like food or art or dance, dress, clothing. These are all aspects of surface culture, so the 10%. But the majority of culture is actually found below the surface, so internal aspects of culture. It's implicit and much more difficult to change. This is where we would find things like beliefs and patterns and myths and values. These are the things that sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing. They're things that are sometimes a little more subjective. These are things that are implicitly learned, they're unconscious, difficult to change, and are subjective. So if somebody asks you, why are you doing this? There might not always be a very clear answer. The response might be something like, well, just because, or because this is the way we do things, or we've always done it this way. This is the way things are done. But it's not as objective and it's not as clear as to why it happens. Things included in this aspect of internal culture or deep culture would include things like core values, ideas about gender roles, authority, decision-making, concepts of time, definition of sin, ideas about justice, and so on. There's so much more that's included in here. And this becomes a tool for self-examination for congregations also, because the question that can be posed is, what, for example, does your faith community believe are its core values, for example, in terms of the internal aspect of culture? So with that in mind, if we look at a blank iceberg, if you were given a blank iceberg to fill in for your faith community, what would you name as aspects of your community's deep culture? What would you name as aspects of your community's external culture? My encouragement might be to look at a blank iceberg and to do your best to fill this in for your community. So this could be some helpful self-examination that's done by a board, a session, a council, committee, or even a presbytery. And some questions might be, what would be in the cultural iceberg for you, so you personally? What might be in the cultural iceberg for your cultural communities or for your church? And by doing this, And figuring out who you are can perhaps help you more effectively engage with one another. So that's a bit about the iceberg. And I'll just mention this: examples of this iceberg or similar iceberg are available online on the United Church's website, united-church.ca/intercultural. And you can download an iceberg there. Continuing on, another way to look at self-examination might be to do some intentional work around power. We might say that power is defined or described as the ability to influence or impose one's will on others, on one another, even if those others resist. So a very simplistic example of power is I have a cat. And in this relationship with my cat, I seem to have all the power. I'm the one who decides what she eats, when she eats, if she can go outside, when she goes outside, when she's going to the vet. I make all of those decisions, and she doesn't have any control. She doesn't have any ability to influence me in this relationship. Sure, she can meow a little bit, or she might, try her best to protest, but at the end of the day, I still have all the power. So the ability to influence each other. So I have all the ability to influence what goes on in my cat's life, and she has very little ability to influence what happens in mine. So a very simplistic example, but we can expand that to look at other relationships and other situations. So we might say that power is personal and systemic. It's also situational. So I'll just name, in order to differentiate the two, personal power is a power that resides in a person. Systemic or institutional power is that power which is given by society or based on a position that somebody holds. And situational, well, it depends on where you're at or who you're with. So power can shift and change with time. So one brief example from my own context. Growing up within a church context, there were times where I felt that I didn't have as much power. In part because of my racial identity, my gender identity, and my age. There were times where I was in meetings or in contexts where I felt like I did not have a lot of power, and where my voice wasn't always heard in the same way. There were times, but when I lived away from the Toronto or the Canadian context, I lived for some time in East Africa. I was the exact same person. All I had done was get on a plane, but things were dramatically different. I was in a situation where I was teaching, and suddenly I was, a person who was an English-speaking North American person with a graduate degree, and who was a teacher in a community that highly respected educators. So I was given a lot of power. I didn't necessarily want that power, but it was given to me anyway, based on my position and based on other aspects of my identity. And so I learned that I had to be very careful in terms of what I was saying, because even if I said something quickly or in passing, it was given a lot of power because of the person that I was. So it's situational. It can shift and change depending on time. I can be the same person, but how my power plays out is different. So why is this important? What is helpful for intercultural work are two things. One, an understanding and self-awareness of one's personal power. So in this situation where I just described in terms of being in East Africa, my own understanding and self-awareness of that situation was really important, so that there were times where I learned that I just needed to be quiet, because whatever I said was taken with more weight than I necessarily wanted to. So one is understanding and self-awareness of one's personal power. Another aspect would be the systemic analysis of power given by society. And that may seem like complicated. It may seem complicated. How do we do a systemic analysis of power that's given by society? One way to do both of this might be to look at a power analysis worksheet. And this is also available online on the United Church's website. I'll offer a brief description here, and then the rest is available online. So there are three columns. In the column that speaks about me, me or you, it invites you to name what that particular identity is. So for age, for example, in the me column, you might say, I am 16 years old. Under your gender identity, you can name how you self-identify in terms of your gender. Your racial identity, you can self-identify there, and so on and so on. So if you fill out that column for who you are, just how you self-describe, how you self-identify, fill in that me column. Then the next column, once you're done that, the next column speaks about your church or your ministry. And you can define that how you want. If you want the church to be your congregation or your presbytery or your conference, you can describe what you mean by your church or your ministry. Then think about your identity in relationship to what you've just named. So if you've named yourself as a 16-year-old, do you feel that as a 16-year-old you have more or less power in your church or your ministry? Do you feel that that gives you more power or less power? If you feel it's something that gives you power, then just put a check mark in that box. If you feel it's something that does not, then just leave it blank. And you can go ahead and do that for all of the columns. Once you've done that for your church and your ministry, then you can repeat that for society. So what does that mean in terms of society? As a 16-year-old in Canadian society, or in your community, in your town, your city, what does that mean? Does that give you power or take away power? What do you think? So again, you can check it or you can leave it blank. Once you've done that, just notice the number of check marks that are there. Notice if the church ministry column is the same as the societal column. Notice if there are a lot of check marks or not very many. And then it's an opportunity for reflection. So there are some questions online that can help guide some of this conversation. But it's an opportunity to do some self-analysis around power, both personal and in relation to society. So if, for example, you discover you have a lot of power, you might be in a situation similar to the one where I was at when I described my situation in East Africa. So how does that impact the way in which you are within community together? So, and if you are doing this online, you are welcome. There are some blank spaces at the bottom. So if you feel that there are some identities that are not named that are important to you, you can add those on also. So the take-home questions would be, what does power look like in your context? And how does power impact the creation of cultural communities? A final step in terms of the self-examination might be to discover a bit more about who you are and who the community around you is by doing an environic study. And an environic study can offer perspectives about your community to discover who is there. And then you can take appropriate action in response. So there's some examples, there's some information available on the United Church's website about environics. So you can go to unitedchurch.ca and Google environics. And there's also a webinar available from the Edge on environics and how that all works. So you can view that if you want. It's one of the past webinars, and you can view that also. And if you choose to do that with your congregation, it's an excellent tool for self-examination. I'll pause at this point and see, are there any questions so far? Lots of questions. How might storytelling or story sharing be part of the congregational engagement? How are the different cultures that we live, in affect one another? Okay, good questions. Story sharing is great. In terms of, do you mean in terms of the self-examination piece, or do you mean broadly in terms of community life? What's the difference between Bible? Okay. Broadly. Okay. So story sharing, I think it can fit in a number of different things. The next piece we're going to look at is worship. So that can definitely be for the congregation to hear one another. Okay, yes. So definitely. Storytelling is great. A church that I was involved in a few weeks ago had a cultural storytelling evening. And it was a wonderful space where people shared just basically their ideas about welcome. So how have you been welcomed into either a church, into a community, and what does that mean from your own cultural context? And the story sharing was really powerful. It was an evening, a Friday evening, and members of the congregation just came and told stories. And it really deepened everybody's understanding of one another and of the church community and what it meant. And people learned that evening things that they didn't know were significant to one another. So people talked about, well, I started coming to this church because this person welcomed me in this way. So that was a really helpful piece in terms of cultural storytelling. And there's also a space, and we'll talk about this in a minute, for story sharing, both from the pulpit and inviting people to share their responses. That evening that I spoke about in terms of the welcome took place it was a Friday evening at 7 o'clock. But I've also seen spaces, both during worship, where people are invited to just turn to one another and talk. Here's a question, just turn to one another and have some conversation. And sometimes it's modeled from the pulpit. Here's a story. Okay, now we invite you to share stories. Or people write things in. I mean, there are lots of ways of doing it, but I think story sharing is an excellent tool. Testimonies are good, yes, definitely. Especially if they're very spontaneous. It's a great tool. Different cultures, how we live and how we affect one another. Canadian culture and Christian culture. Sorry, does that answer your question, Dana? Okay, great. So the different cultures that we live in and how they affect one another. Cultures, sometimes we shift depending on the cultural context in which we are in. So all of us are in multiple cultures. So, I might say, well, I'm a Canadian, I'm a Christian, I'm part of, a young adult group, I'm part of this, I'm part of that. And all of them, we all adapt a little bit depending on where we're at. But all of them also intersect and interact in different ways. So, sometimes it's hard. Oh, okay, sorry. In some ways, I think in some ways we are living in a context where where we have multiple cultural identities. But are those identities interacting and intersecting? That's a question. I know, for example, some people in my friendship groups act one way at home and act a completely different way, either at church or a completely different way at school. But in none of those places, they would say, there's no space where I feel completely free to be my full self. Like I'm maybe hiding one aspect of my identity. I worked in a school board for a while, and I was not encouraged, but was in a context where I had to downplay my Christian identity. So I didn't feel like I was able to be my full self, and so on and so on. So we have these multiple cultural groups that we are part of, and we're shifting between those groups. But the question is, can we live out all of our identities in all of those spaces? Perhaps, yes. And perhaps some of the hope is that the church might offer some of this integrative space together. Is that helpful? Okay, no problem. I'll just say a little bit about power. So in terms of power, the way in which we've described it, the ability to influence, is the way in which most people are describing it. However, it manifests itself, we might say it manifests itself in different ways. So all of our work, much of our work collectively, is rooted in power imbalances. So as we speak about things like racial justice, things such as empire, things such as work around gender justice, becoming intercultural church, all of these are rooted in power imbalances. So there are just different kinds of power imbalances. So in terms of groups of difference, part of creating intercultural spaces, of creating equitable spaces, is about shifting these so that there are, so that the power imbalances has shifted. Does that make sense? So that's the hope of creating these equitable spaces in the church, or more equitable spaces, where we're always striving more and more and more. How do we become more inclusive? How do we become even more justice seeking? We're always on this journey of what we hope to become. So any other questions? Okay, we just have a few more minutes, so let me speak a little bit about worship, perhaps, in terms of practical ideas. And again, feel free to ask questions as we continue on. So we spoke about community life. In terms of worship, in the context of worship, language becomes very important. So I would say it's very helpful to use inclusive and expansive language, and using diverse imagery to describe God. So in the Bible, God is described in multiple ways. But in addition to that, language can also include using languages other than English. So perhaps there are people in your congregations who speak additional languages. Perhaps it might also be possible to incorporate sign language. But even offering a greeting or something short can be impactful. One option might be to do a bit of a congregational survey and learn what languages people are most comfortable with. So to ask questions such as, can everybody understand what is being said? Is everybody able to contribute to church life through language? And then strive to do whatever is possible to ensure that everyone has a chance to use their own language, if possible. Another idea might be to consider using simultaneous interpretation or written translations, if it's possible. Or to invite people to pray in their own language. God doesn't require English, but inviting people to speak in the language of their hearts can sometimes be really powerful. Continuing on with worship, we might also speak about music. It's very helpful to include a range of songs from all around the world, and that's a great way to begin creating intercultural spaces. There are many, many global songs, both in Voices United and in More Voices. And sometimes singing in different languages can be challenging, but it can also be very exciting. I know that one church that I was at, the music leader introduced a song by saying it was going to be sung in both English and Yoruba, which is one of the languages spoken in Nigeria. And together, I think we only sang maybe 2 lines in Yoruba. But after church, I watched as one family who had recently immigrated from Nigeria, they came running over to the music leader to say thank you. And they were beaming with excitement, and they talked about how it spoke to their soul to have an aspect of their own cultural community reflected in worship. And they spoke about how they had never more felt part of the church community than they did when they heard the introduction to that song. It was so powerful to them. And then after that, just based on that one experience, they then offered themselves for leadership in any way that the church needed them. And it seemed like, so in some ways, such a simple thing. I mean, we really did only sing 2 lines of a song in a language other than English. But for this family, it was so transformative. So even if you don't have families who have recently moved from places outside of Canada, singing songs in languages other than English can invite us to stand in solidarity with people who are living in those lands. So during this current famine in East Africa, for example, as I've been in contexts where we sing in Swahili, there's a stronger sense of what it means to be part of the global community. So there is a bit about music. Physical space. It's possible, I believe, to create a physical space that embraces and emphasizes difference. So some of this might involve using fabrics from around the world or crosses from around the world. It might use different kinds of art. Or we could, invite perhaps the children or youth to talk about what kinds of things they might want to see. We can invite anybody to talk about what they would want to see. And then to use a variety of cultures to enable different cultural groups to identify. So whether it's a meeting room or whether it's, the space where people first enter when they come in, what does that space look like, and how does that effectively engage difference? Sermons, I mentioned this briefly in passing before, but the sermons and any kind of conversation time are an excellent space to intentionally talk about difference. I would encourage people to talk about power and privilege and racism, and to make these part of the things that are talked about in the context of worship, perhaps from the pulpit or in any other space, and to talk about the biblical call to become an intercultural church. Go ahead and preach about anti-racism. Go ahead and speak and preach about equity and justice, and through that can also honor the multiple cultures that are in community. And we can talk about our call to be an intercultural church. So I would encourage people, don't shy away from the tough stuff. Go ahead and talk about it. And sometimes that can be really interesting and engaging. And there are some worship ideas online which might also offer some cues. Aruna, intercultural dolls and toys in nursery and Sunday school class. Yes, that's an excellent point in terms of creating intercultural spaces, of using a diversity of dolls and toys. So thank you for that. In terms of practical ideas for worship, continuing to ask questions. So continually to ask the questions, is there enough variety so that people can find themselves in the liturgy? So, I spoke about that family, for example, who was so excited to hear a language other than English in the music, and that was great for them. So to continually ask that question, what does that mean? And that continues to shape worshiping life. Another point might be to regularly let different cultural groups influence your style of worship. So it is helpful to have special occasions and special days, but more than that, on a regular basis. I remember one family or there was one group I spoke to, and they were so excited because they said, we were so excited because we were asked, somebody came to us and intentionally invited us. They said, what would you like to see in worship? And they said, nobody ever asked us that question before. And it was something seemingly simple, like, we'd love to be able to hear drums once in a while. And they were able to do that. And for them, they just felt so much more part of the church community, and so much more ownership in terms of what was happening. And again, then became more involved in the church just because they were asked a question, what do you want to see? And we're given the space to influence worship as a whole. The last point under practical ideas for worship, dare I say, pull together a committee. Pull together a committee or another group to talk about how can we really create intercultural worship in this space. I'm recommending a committee or a group because then it's never just one person alone, but it can be a group of people to look at, and a group of people then has joint ownership of what happens, to look at worship life through an intercultural lens, and to ask questions around things like liturgies and visuals and music and symbols and people resource groups, biblical stories, sermon starters, and consideration for languages other than English. So these are some ideas, but they could ask more and more questions. So how do we create intercultural worship? It could be perhaps if there's a worship committee, it could be a section of the worship committee, or it could be a focus of the worship committee. But to begin to ask those questions, how do we look at our worship life through an intercultural lens? I will pause at this point and ask if there are questions. I'm also aware of time. It's 8:05, and I know we said we were going to go for an hour. So I just wanted to check in about both questions and next steps. Hmm.
Thank you very much, Adele, for this important discussion on living interculturally. You've given us lots to think about, especially in terms of worship and ways we can create intercultural spaces and learn from each other.